Well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening for Art in Dialogue in the Belly of the Architect with Anthony Viscardi and Tim Higgins. It's my pleasure to welcome you. My name is Stacy Brennan. I'm the Curator of Education for the Lehigh University Art Galleries. In conjunction with our Art, Architecture, and Design faculty exhibition, which is currently on view in the main galleries at Lehigh University, we launched the Art in Dialogue series. Art in Dialogue events pair faculty members with a broad range of experts to spotlight interdisciplinary research and creative practice. While our galleries are currently closed, you can view many of these works on our website, as well as recordings from previous programs and great resources of our collection. We hope that these conversations and the conversation today will provide you with an opportunity to tap into the experience and expertise of the Lehigh faculty and community experts like Tim Higgins, and to dive deeper into their work and research. Today, we are excited to explore Tony's work of Shadow and Void and his theoretical inquiry: if an object can cast a shadow, can a shadow cast an object? Professor Viscardi is a nationally and internationally known scholar teacher in the design and art of architecture. He has a special interest in study abroad and established the Lehigh in Italy summer program in 1995 and serves as its director. There he teaches his students about Italian public places through sketching, as well as studies the work of Italian architect Carlo Scarpa, which has been a topic of his research for over 20 years. He has conducted design workshops and presentations at institutions of higher learning in Canada, Malaysia, Europe, Brazil, and Puerto Rico, and most recently was invited to teach a month-long creative design workshop for 40 professional architects at the Beijing Victory Star firm. It's wonderful. Tim Higgins is a working artist and freelance writer. Thank you for joining us today, Tim. He's an arts journalist, editor, reporter, publisher, and living and working in the Lehigh Valley for the past 35 years. He has interviewed and written about major artists working in the international, national, and regional levels, including Roy Lichtenstein, Jamie Wyeth, Judy Pfaff, Angel Suarez, Roger Dean, Dean Weaver, Adal Maldonado, sorry, I can't use my words today, and hosts of others, and remains committed to promoting the visual arts in and around the Lehigh Valley, for which we are super grateful. We are so thankful to have the two of them here tonight. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tony. Thank you so much. And we'll take questions at the end of this presentation. If you could please hold your questions and type them into the chat box, we will help to answer all of those when they are done. So thank you so much. And now I turn it over to Tony.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Let me see something here a second. Let me pause this one. So I want to talk to you about my work today, and I'll show you examples, but I want to begin with my general attitude about the creative process. You know, for me, the creative process is something that is almost like a game, and it involves, my point of view, play. So the way I do a lot of my creative work as well as teaching is I set up a kind of vocabulary of things, whether it be shadows or objects or letters, doesn't matter. And from that kind of vocabulary, I use them to make things. So what you're going to see when we start thinking about shadows, because I became fascinated with shadows, well, a long time ago when I was a young boy, only child, I played with my shadow a lot. So I always kind of liked it, liked jumping in it. And I always liked that it took the shape of the things that it fell on, you know, so it may come from one thing, but then when you see it, let me pause on this one for a second, because you can see how these shadows really rip up the space. I mean, you can't tell what that space is like. And so that for me, you know, as an architect was really intriguing in terms of how the sun could rake through a space, or how in Renaissance period, they would profile buildings so that they create shadows. So the shadow has always been a very prominent element in architecture and in art and decorico. But in architecture, it's always kind of had this more sacred thing where you bury the spirit of someone in the building, and that shadow protects it. So back in the 80s, I think, I started to try to create this bibliography because I wanted to focus on shadows. So the first two lines you're seeing are shadows on my hand. So these are shadows on my hand that I pulled out, the first two rows. And then the second two rows, I took a compass, and as I was drawing with the compass, I was tracing the shadow, and I continued to move along. So I started to notice that it actually created somewhat of bibliography. And when I was first trying to create a theory about this, I would pull some of these out and then put them on a grid, or, to deal with this idea of how shadow could maybe be looked at as a little less rational, more intuitive. It presents itself, it comes from one thing, retains some of its identity from the object, but then distorts. All that stuff became intriguing to me. So the first kind of practicum I set up is I wanted to set up that grid like you just saw in this one, the grid over here. And so I set up the grid, and I was allowed to only make one, this is the model I use. I was only allowed to make one angle in the model. Let me back up for a second there. I knew I was going to have this too fast. Because I knew when the sun was moving, because what I do is I'm making the model. As I'm making the model, I'm tracing the shadow every 10 minutes, the whole shadow. So these are the shadow maps from this. And I call this the architect because it was the first one I made when I was starting to codify this into a process. And I ended up, these are ink drawn and ink, and then this is a reverse photograph of that. But I really started to investigate the notion of the object and its referent, which is the shadow. And then the second one I tried to work on was the infamous 9-square grid. In architecture, we're always dealing with this 9-square grid. So I took one, had a 9-square grid the students made or something. And I've been collecting these blocks. When I was at Georgia Tech, a lot of the graduate students were making these really beautiful things. There were a lot of leftover blocks. And so I would collect all these beautiful leftover blocks. And in this particular model or shadow mapping series, I used the blocks to start to deteriorate or to erode the grid. Then I had the first idea of this thing about if an object can cast a shadow, can a shadow cast an object? So what I did is I took the architect drawing back here, I multiplied it times 4. Sorry, I knew I would talk faster than these things. And I asked 3 friends of mine, artists, to each take a corner, and we had to interpret the drawing in 3 dimensions. And we worked on it for 4 or 5 days, 3 or 4 6-packs of beer. It was fun, and it was interesting to see how the drawing became 3-dimensional aside from just extrusion. And that's the thing in architecture, we're always wanting, a building is not just a plan extruded, it's a 3-dimensional space. So this was a big learning thing for me. And as you know, I really believe in design build. I've been doing them since I've been here. In 2007, I was invited to do a show in Buffalo. And this was an important time in my career for several things. One, I was going up for full professor, but secondly, I was trying to pull all my work together and start to see it as an ensemble. And so I had the opportunity here to present my drawings full scale. So when you're looking at these 2 drawings here, they're actually inked drawings of the full scale shadow map. So while I was shadow mapping, making these things, tracing, I would then throw away the model, and then I would ink what I had there, and that became what I call a primitive. And those primitives I then used to make larger drawings. In this case, they were 3 feet by 6 feet, and I was able to hang them parallel to each other, about 4 or 5 feet between them, so that people could move through them and I could see their shadow. As well, I had several artists working with me up there, a dance troupe, a music guy, And so we actually did a choreographed opening where dancers and music would move through them. So you saw the gallery viewer becoming part of the drawing. And it was quite wonderful. It was something for me, and I think for any artist, to have a whole gallery to show your work in large scale. And so this first phase of my kind of understanding the shadow was at full scale, and it was usually done with ink. And then that show was the first show that I did that had the large scale drawings where I was actually using the full scale primitives, which I'll explain in a second. So these are the things I would normally ink. And I have a thing about inking, I've said before. I don't know if it has to do with Catholic guilt, but I feel like I'm stealing shadows. So when I steal these shadows, and again, in architectural history, masons used to actually bury someone in the foundation of the building so their spirit would be unleashed. Then they eventually got more civilized and would just measure the shadow and bury the rope in the basement. So it's, and that person was going to die because you stole their spell. So there's all this stuff. So that on top of my Catholic guilt, I figure I got to work to own it. So I ink it. Inking it takes a long, long time. You know, people look at my little drawings, they think they take a long time. These take a long time, but I love it because it forces me to slow down and really kind of see my hand move. But anyway, they become the primitives. Now, sometimes I take the primitives and they're traced on vellum or mylar. And here you can see how the layering process that I use. So what you're seeing here is the primitive down below. And I'm now using the primitive, because I own it, to start to collage a larger drawing. So the larger drawing here is 3 foot by 6 foot. This one is, I think, 3 foot by 4 foot. But here you can see these are the two primitives that made this drawing, and this is 3 foot by 6 foot. So after so again, it comes back to that notion of the game, where I first make a model and trace the shadows. I throw away the model. I have the memory of the model, the shadow. It's kind of like a plan or plan. Then I'm taking those primitives and allowing them to, I'm allowed to now manipulate them, collage them in a process. Now this drawing, even though it's 3 foot by 6 foot, I do no pre-planning. I start by tracing one part and the piece is completely additive. And I think, again, I'm fairly old and I've been doing art for probably 50 years. So it's embedded in my body. So when I'm doing this stuff, it's really kind of me doodling in a way. I'm doodling with the lines and moving them, and I'm making lines darker or lighter. And the thing I discovered when I was doing these drawings on Mylar is that the graphite smears as I'm drawing. So in other words, when I was taught as a draftsman, if I was right-handed, I would start on the left and go right so you don't smear. Now I do the opposite. I start on the right, and as I'm drawing, my hand is smearing the lead. Then I'm allowed to go back and subtractively create the piece. So again, that was a major discovery to me. All these things in this role of play that I'm talking about, or you might even say the art of invention, all deals with discovery. How do you make yourself, as I tell my students, to be prepared for amazement, to really see what you're drawing. And for me, it's a slow process is what helps me daydream and see all the other things that are going on. In 2010, we had our first faculty show in a long time, Ricardo, who I owe so much to, because when I came to the university, Ricardo wouldn't meet me because he was having an argument with another professor. And then after the first couple of weeks, even, or a month, and maybe a month, he had to write an evaluation. He came to me. We became great friends. And he's always kind of guided me. He came to my house once and saw the two directions I go in my work. One direction is more formal, like these drawings. The other one's more material, where I plant objects in plaster and I react to the object more tapious or booty, similar. I'd like to maybe compare myself to. But he told me to stick with, really push the shadow language. And that first show he gave me in '93 was really a breakthrough for me because I was only here for a year, and it really introduced me to the community, and it was great. The other great thing, I received the McDowell Colony Fellowship in 2012. And as every artist knows, you rarely have the luxury of spending a month and only thinking about your work. No other responsibilities. They feed you, they do, and you're in this most idyllic place for a month. And for me, it was cathartic. So it really made me accept myself as an artist. Here you see I'm doing the full-scale shadow casting. So what you're seeing, oops, wait, wrong way. What you see me doing out here, and I have to mention they gave me the best place. This was the Alexander studio where Marion McDowell, when she went to, I'm going to go back for a second. When she went to Northern Italy, saw this beautiful chapel, and she said, I want to build one of them on the site. So when I got there, they pulled me up to this place, and I thought I was in heaven, and the porch faced south. So it was great. So that was an amazing opportunity for me, a sacrifice for other people in my life, but it was a real gift to me. And I want to thank my wife always for helping me do these things. But having that studio with this giant fireplace that I could sit in, I mean, I was in a dream, so I produced a lot of stuff because, you really get this opportunity. And I was able to have this big studio. And here you can see that I'm starting to ink a large shadow casting I did. It's about, I think it's 3.5 by 8 or 7. And it's called The Colonist. It's a big shadow and kind of looks like a figure. And you can see here, I had the opportunity to make things big. And rarely you have an opportunity to do that. So I blew some of my smaller drawings up. I created these two colonists, Colonist 1, Colonist 2, and they became the premise for me making more art. So here you can see I reduced them. So let me tell you a little bit about this process. So once I tell you before, I did, most of my tracings were full scale. But when I got the McDowell Fellowship, I had the opportunity to do things large, but then when I came back home, I had to work in a small space. So I started to reduce these primitives and do small tracings. This one's called The Bachelors. I know it's a rip from Duchamp, my favorite person, but it just felt like these four going for a clear image. And again, I don't pre-think these things. The story tends to come about. Here you can see the whole idea of me being able to draw these drawings really large where the line got thick was really interesting because when the line got thick, it made the object read slightly different. So it's a funny thing, when I make really small drawings, people look at them and they say, wow, they look like cities and everything. When I do really big drawings, they say they look like objects. It looks like a vase or something. And I think it has to do with the thickness of the line. And that was a discovery for me again, too, because again, I'm an architect. In the belly of the architect are all these things: scale, proportion, blah, 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 how to make a building. I've been liberated from making a building, but I'm still building art in a way that I always have. And it's been enjoyable for me. And I was able to compare scaling up to scaling down. So you can see these larger drawings were way different than when I got really small with a drawing. And when I got small with a drawing, again, the scale seemed to change and you seemed to become either larger and smaller. This one, when I drew it, again, started to feel like an urban mimic. And again, and it's big, it's 3 feet by 4 feet. Let me tell you about this process, because this one was interesting for me, because I give these projects to my students. We do a shadow casting project where they have to take the shadow and make a site model. When I was at McDowell, I had the privilege of, well, I don't know if it's a privilege, but I got to be my own student. So I got to do all the things I always told them to do. And so here you see me taking the map and actually constructing a three-dimensional model out of it, piece by piece, by segmenting it. And it was really great. And this is how it ended up. And again, I always use this as an example for my students to show them that I'm not just telling them what to do, that I can do it too. And I know it's not easy. So I know all this stuff's not easy. So this piece was a piece I ended up at again, it was more like a milestone for me in terms of what I did. Then when I got back from McDowell, my great friend Ricardo and Martha came to me and said, I would like to give you a solo show to show what you did at McDowell. And I was so honored. And I started to try to understand digital craft and technology. So I was working with Michael Moore at the time. He was my student back then. And I think he wasn't anymore at this point. But I started to do these drawings and of course asked the student to transfer them into whatever it needed to be to go to the laser cutter. And then I would have Mike kind of massage them for me. So one time he cut them. We were practicing on how deep you can cut. So one time he just scored it. And then one time he went all the way through and I said, this is great, I love it. And so I started to make the two walls of this construction. And so this construction, again, came about in an interesting way because it's plexiglass. Plexiglass reflects, but it also casts shadows. And when I was building this, again, I was thinking about scale. And so you can see my little dunce cap here with this. And I actually sold this one, but it never made it to the buyer. It was destroyed in transit, unfortunately. But this was a great experiment for me because it's a double wall. When I was thinking about this as an architect, I kept imagining having water underneath this, so it looked like the way water's under ice, and then the water might go through the walls. But I'd need probably $10 billion to do it. But maybe someday when William's rich, he'll commission me. So this is an interior view of it. Again, capturing the spaces that shadows and light can make are pretty amazing because this particular model, not only, I don't have it here, but not only projected shadows, it actually refracted light, which was really interesting. So this is the show Ricardo gave me in 2013, Tracing Time to Measure Space. Marilyn Jones designed a catalog for me, and my wife, Cheryl Dugan, was my editor. And it was really a good show for me because it, again, allowed me to see everything I was doing and see it in a way that made connections. So the columnists came out, and in this particular show, on this slide here, Jeffrey was great because he said, let me pause this for a second, because he was saying, I want to project this like bat signal. So it was great. I usually destroy these models. So this is one of the few models I kept, and he set up a light to shoot the bat signal. So it was a nice thing to see. It was great working with the three of them. But here you can see it casts shadows that are in many different ways. And then I hung my work. And again, Mike and Brian actually helped me design these frames so they hung out from the wall. And there was a series of vertical ones. And again, these pieces are made when I reduce the primitive and I'm working on Mylar. Now, when I'm working on Mylar smaller, your hand smears more. So when it smears more, I can bring the piece in and out of depth a lot. And so these are, several of the smaller pieces. Usually they're made with one primitive, sometimes two, but usually one primitive I use to kind of meander along the tracing. And these are about 14 by 30 or something like that in size. And again, when people look at them like this one here, they see cities, and I see them too, but I only see them as they come out. And, it's kind of like when Paul Clay said, the form is in the forming. Then I was lucky to do an artist in residence at the Experimental Printmaking Institute with Curly and Jace Clark, and both of them let me go back on this for a second. I'll speed up again. But it was interesting because when I first went there, I said to Curly, I want to capture the smear. And he said, well, you have to capture it, but it's not going to be the smear. It's going to be the media's effect on your drawing. So, and it really was true, because these are segments of my drawings. And when I learned, like, this is a viscosity print where I burnt the plate for like 24 hours. So when I was able to ink it, it created shadows in the lines. And then I got to play with some silk screening. And you can see it's coming from my figure of the colonist that I've distorted a little bit. And I played a little around with embossing and ink, and I liked it. I liked it more than I initially did. Initially, it was a little too anal retentive, and it just made me feel like I had to pre-think too many things. And as you can sense, I'm not that kind of a pre-thinker. And then this was another joyful accident. Okay, so I was making this model here to prepare, actually this was before I was commissioned the Allentown Art Museum. I was making this thing because I wanted to make a kind of three-dimensional drawing. But I just bought an airbrush, but again, like I was saying, like printing, I didn't want to have to mask things out. So I was getting really frustrated. So as I was making this model, I just started spraying through it. And I got this thing, and I went, holy shit. I mean, this is, it's like, wow, that's the first time I'm painting a shadow. I'm not outlining a shadow, I'm painting a shadow. And so I started to take all my other things and started painting them as shadows. And the way they're done is that I had because I've done several, I did several pieces from this particular primitive. And so I had the laser cut pieces of chipboard, and I again, accidentally once was playing with the airbrush through them, and I realized you can spray through them. And so I'm actually spraying through templates of my work. And so these are the two first ones that I did, and they're of the architect again. And you can see right here, that's where my finger was, where I was holding the template. And so again, when I did this, I couldn't believe it happened, frankly. And it happened within an hour and a half. And I said, I better leave, because I know if I keep working, I'm going to screw it up. So I left it. And then I came back the next day, and I kept doing them over and over again. And they were so much fun. And again, it got to the point where now I was actually painting the shadow, which was exciting for me. And here's more of the work I'm doing based on the colonist. If you remember that bachelor's drawing, I want to do a full scale, or this scale, probably like 3 foot by 6 foot version of that with airbrush. And so I'm kind of working on that right now. And so that brings me to what I have in the show. What I have in the show started from, like everything else that you've seen, the template things, which are templates of my drawings. And then I would always, I have this, I guess it's a good thing and a bad thing. I tend to collect things, and they become a problem when I have too many. But I have all these leftover pieces from the laser cutter. And to me, they're like the shadows, because the objects the students wanted, they cut and they left the template. So I went, wow, that's pretty cool. And so now when I had my studio on Broad Street, I had this great window facing south. And so I started just putting them together, and I had this thought about books. I want to make books. So if I made that wedge, I can then play with these things. And then I started airbrushing through them. So I said, okay, this is cool. I'm airbrushing through them, and I'm building more of these things. I think this was the one in the show where the light comes from the back. I think I call it the Book of Light. Here you can see the way the light went through it. This was more of I don't know what I was thinking of in terms of it, but then I started to put them together because there were two, and I started to do this and take photographs of them from above, and they just started creating these incredible architectural spaces. And then I started to play God and made a little city. I started to putting these all around, and just kind of having fun. I mean, it was really fun. And then the first one of the series that I really liked was this one, which I call In the Belly of the Architect. Oops, sorry, I didn't want to end the show. Sorry, hit the wrong thing. So this one, after about 4 or so, I started to see things happening. And there is a famous movie called In the Belly of the Architect. I can't remember who the director is. But I think it felt appropriate for me because before I got to McDowell, I always say I'm not trained as an architect that does art. But art's always been in my belly. It's always been part of me because for many reasons. My uncle, Nick Cardy, was a famous cartoonist for Superman and everything. So he was like the magic man for me. And then being an architect forces you to do some things that deal with the act of making. And so this thing stuck out to me. The second one I did was really pure play. I think I might have done one that I really hated. So I kind of, sometimes you go into these things with nothing to lose. So you say, okay, the hell with it, I'll just keep working on it. And this one came out and I really like it. The last piece I'm going to show deals with shadow landings. I'm not going to spend a lot of time of it, but it was a piece that was really important for me that the Allentown Art, a second, I don't want to start this yet. The Allentown Art Museum commissioned me to do a 90-foot wall. And they gave me a studio in Allentown down the street on Hamilton Street. I met Tim there. I met all these great people from Allentown, and they watched me make this first out of cardboard and then at its final piece. And then one of my students took this, just a second, took this video. So I'm gonna end with this. This runs for about a minute, and then I'm gonna ask Tim to join in on my conversation. Like again, Tim, I met Tim a while back. We've had great conversations about art. I unfortunately didn't have Nick Sawicki or Susan Card as a history of art teacher. I had history of architecture from a very bad professor. So my history is not very good, but I like kind of being a backfeeder, meaning after somebody sees something I'm doing, if they tell me, well, this reminds me of blah, blah, blah. It's the same way I teach my students. I don't give them all the stuff up front, only until they have a question. And so I'm hoping that Tim will reflect on that stuff as other people have. He's been able to see my work in several different mediums, as a full piece, as printmaking, and as airbrush and drawing. So I feel honored to have him come and talk about my work. And you can say whatever you want at any time. This will run out in a second, Tim.
Well, I'll pick up where you left off, and that is our meeting. 6 years ago, I had no idea who Tony Viscardi was. We had heard, well, along with many other artists in Allentown, that there was something called the Creativity Lab happening on the corner of 5th and Hamilton, between 5th and 6th and Hamilton and Allentown. So we went down there and we met Tony Viscardi, and we met the nicest guy in the world who not only showed us what he was doing, but like he said, introduced us to this concept of what if a shadow projected an object, which blew my mind. What a concept. And to me, this kind of thinking by an artist, which Tony is. Tony is, to me, more artist than architect, only because I know him as artist, is much of what 20th century into 21st century art is about. Tony has absorbed 20th century art. He talks about it, Duchamp, Duchamp's last painting, 2M, incorporated shadows into it, which was a kind of a mind-blowing thing at the time. It still is. Those shadows would mean something to Duchamp. They mean something to Tony. What I am interested in Tony's work is, and he can disagree with me, and we can talk about this, but there is no naturalism. There is no flowers. There are no trees. There is no overt sentimentality in Tony's work. I don't stand in front of his work and cry. I don't stand in front of his work and feel anything but awe at the craftsmanship that Tony exhibits in his work. that craftsmanship we were able to see, which was a great thing when he did the shadow landings, was that about 5 years ago, Tony? That we got to see this artist in action and his process, which is what I'm going to ask him about. I think in many ways, Tony represents concepts that are of our time. And I always think an artist should be of their time, and Tony is that. And what I mean by that is he addresses ideas of perception and seeing in art, which are things that absorb artists since the very beginning. You can go all the way back to cave paintings with these ideas. In fact, caves come up invariably when talking about Tony and his work with shadows, because we talk about Plato's cave. The concept of Plato's cave, and if I get this, I'm always a little put off when I talk of philosophy, but the idea that Plato presented with a man in a cave whose back is to the entrance, who only sees the world that we perceive in terms of shadow. So that when that man leaves the cave and he's confronted with the three-dimensionality of the world, it's a totally different world, it's a totally different experience.
That blew my mind.
That idea is kind of reversed with Tony. He lives in the three-dimensional world, yet he's interested in what is this thing that shadows project, that are projected by object. And object is the underlying thing of what Marcel Duchamp was all about, which Tony alluded to before. I also am a big fan of Marcel Duchamp. Tony, one of my questions would be to you is, do you see this, these aspects of philosophy and metaphysics in your work?
Yeah. I think my work deals with time and space. Okay, so, I'm dealing with time and space and light, because light for me is the means of determining time. Okay, so as the light moves, things progress. So yeah, and I've always been intrigued with Einsteinian physics. I've never completely understood it, but the fact that something can go so fast that three-dimensional becomes two-dimensional or one-dimensional. It also reminds me of the book Flatlanders, where the two-dimensional world just won't believe the three-dimensional world. And so metaphysically, it's with me, because I also feel like shadows, Le Corbusier, all of them talked about without light, there's not architecture, because the shadow creates the form. He was talking more about shades. I'm talking about shadows. But the thing about shadows is they're always there, and they're always a reference. So if you're looking down and you see the shadow of a plane, it's up there. So they're always referring to something else. And even in my work, I think sometimes my work, because I make a lot of the shadow stuff out of sticks, the stick, when you look at the stick from the edge, it has a three-dimensionality. So all of a sudden, the characteristics of these dead objects are embedded in these memories, and when I'm collaging, they reveal themselves in a way. So yeah, the drawing, and I used to, back when I was in my 20s, I did a lot of doodling in my life, and a lot of doodling of just listening to music, tapping the pen, and it would turn into more of those natural things. Now I doodle with this stuff. And so back to your question though, I think like a filmmaker deals with time, space, and light, I'm dealing with time, space, and light. And my carrier is initially Mylar. And then I use that Mylar to generate other objects. I don't know if that answers, but close.
Well, the use of light almost seems to be a hidden medium in your work. We don't see the light necessarily, it's implied. There are implications of where the light was, where it is now, where it has been. That use of light, it reinforces the idea of presence in your work. There's always a presence of whether it's shape, form, light, time, space, like you say. Can you elaborate on that a little bit, this idea of presence in your work?
Well, let's take shadow landings as an example. Let me share again. Are you sharing? You're sharing, Stacy, right? No. Am I sharing?
I am sharing, but you should be able to share yours.
Okay, so I don't see. Oh, there it is. Sorry. Okay. It won't let me. Do you want to stop the screen share? Yeah. Okay. So now. So if I go back to this. Wait a minute. Where the heck is it? Okay, here. Gotta get rid of this thing. So when you're looking at shadow landings in this view, I tried to set the lights up to time as you moved along, because I feel like my work, as well as most architecture, is like a passive machine. It's constantly changing as the sun moves through. So in doing this particular piece, while I was building it, I created this section over here that in those 3 times would allow me to kind of turn this roll and create this palimpsest. Palimpsest is a word I really like, because it talks about the layers of things. And in architecture, we tend to do that a lot in the sense that while you're drawing, you're looking through a lot of different layers. So when you're seeing this piece, I'm going to get a little over here. When you see these layers being pulled off, you're seeing how the light and movement and shadow changes it. So in my point of view, and I've said this to students before, I think as I move, I change the nature of space, because I'm molding it. As I move through the space, I'm the center point, and so the space becomes plastic. So when I think about this piece, and it was funny to watch people, because as you walk from one end to the other, you would see a shadow appear and then be reflected in the aluminum and then go back. So in a way, you're kind of, again, the work that I do in this kind of stuff deals with me layering 60 minutes, you might say. If I traced every 15 minutes, did one tracing, you have many, many layers which give characteristics of the object that the object will never see, because the object doesn't move. So in terms of that kind of notion of, let me stop sharing here. Stop sharing. Oh, wait a minute. I got all kinds of junk here. Did you not see anything while I was doing that?
No, I don't think anybody was seeing
Okay.
what you were referring to.
I was referring to it anyway. On this particular, so let me share it again and do it right this time. Now you see it, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Coming up.
So now when you look at this piece, I'm going to put the thing that's moving and I'm going to move it. When you're coming around here and you're seeing like this piece here, when you're seeing this, as you would move, the shadow would move, and therefore the space started to breathe. So not only was the timing changing, but as you move, your angle on the piece changed. And that's what happens in architecture. You can see architecture sometimes straight on, but a lot of buildings you only see obliquely. So you're walking down the sidewalk and you're seeing the building. And some architects design for that. Even in historic architecture, like in Paris, the buildings go back and forth on the street. They're not lined up. So it creates a rhythm. So in terms of the notion of time layered is what this thing's about. And I know I've written once before this notion that when I'm doing the shadow mapping, the map is actually creating a record of itself in the process of me making it. Because again, I'm tracing these shadows every time. It's kind of tracing a memory of that whole thing. And so it becomes layered. It becomes dense with time and space, you might say.
Is your use of shadow something of a comment on what we would consider traditional painting?
No.
Okay.
No, I mean, no.
It's not two-dimensional versus three-dimensional?
Well, it is in the sense that again, if I were, I'm working on a series of quarantine drawings and they're small, but you can actually see the dimension in them. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure how to answer the question.
The illusion that you're creating, and it is an illusion, we agree on that.
Yeah.
That illusion can be a little trippy sometime, a little, your concepts are a little heady at times, I think.
Yeah.
You incorporate, I think, a narrative in your work, such as when Shadow Landings was explained to me, there's the prow of a boat in there.
Yeah, but it came about. It was interesting because, again, I was working with a carpenter who is a shipbuilder. I had the first piece designed, the big one. At the end, I even when I got there and was at the creativity lab, I still hadn't figured out the last couple of feet, and they were going crazy at the museum. So finally, what I wanted to do is continue the process. So that thing bending out allowed the shadows, which were now objects from the landing, to relocate themselves on the frame and create new shadows. But in the process, it looked like a boat. And so after it, the whole narrative of this boat leaving or this thing leaving, I always saw the things that were unfinished shadows as the future. I saw the original sculpture I had there, the architect that I made out of steel, was the past. And like you're saying, the present was remaking that middle section. And kind of I look at it that way, where I had to completely immerse myself in the art of improvisation while making that middle piece and then translating it from cardboard to material and communicating with carpenters and digital machines. That's what architects do. I wasn't really good in that coordination thing, but I'm getting better now. So yeah, I think that kind of comes close to your question.
Is narrative important in your work?
Yeah, but it's always afterward. Okay, so I never, and I do this again with the students, where I like to fiddle about for a while, and then when I see something that I've created, the story begins. And so my wife Cheryl does this a lot too, where she does these charcoal drawings and she ends up seeing things and then pulling them out and erasing them. So the drawing is kind of giving back to you as you're drawing. And that's what I do when I'm drawing these pencil things. I'm starting out without a narrative. Halfway through, it goes through about 10 narratives. And then when it's done, I have to give it a name. And that always was problematic for me until I went to McDowell, because I said, well, it's just 1, 2, 3. And this one female artist was pretty obstinate and said, no, you have to label them. I said, well, why? And she says, well, first it becomes a handle. And my retort to that was, well, I want my piece to remain ambiguous. But she said it can't remain that ambiguous. So what I end up doing is reading my work afterward. And if it does have a narrative, that's where I put it in. But it's like architecture too. Architects make buildings based on a narrative, but they're not there to tell every person that comes in what the narrative is. So you have to kind of see it. And like when people like you and other people came to me and said it looks like a boat, and the minute you say it looks like something, the narrative comes. And because I do that with my students. We can look at things that this has a cylinder with sparkly things in it, but the minute we say it's a glass, it's no longer anything else. So I liked when people came in and said, wow, boat, and my friend and I, Jeff, would laugh, and yeah, it does look like a boat, and it is. So yeah, I'm more of a, like I said, a back feeder than a front loader.
I said originally that there's not much naturalism in your work. Would you agree with that?
Well, yes, I'm not mimicking nature, but when you look at my pencil drawings start to deal with you might say, the geometric permutations that nature goes through. So it's kind of similar to M.C. Escher. You can look at his things that multiply and get small. They don't look like nature, but they act like nature. So I think
some of your drawings, just that you showed here, one looked like a bird to me. One, like you said, some look like cities, which is organic. Right. But in your process, is the organic a thought, or is it strictly a concept abstract?
No, the organic in me would be more if something was acting organically, it wouldn't be a noun where it looks organic, meaning it looks like an object. If the work, a lot of times when I studied Scarpa, as I said, a lot of times the work looks incomplete. It's not like it's not finished. It's just left to a point where you want the viewer to complete a little bit. So that's what happens in my drawings, because you're seeing the memory of something that looks like an object. So it might be two sticks, or I usually don't use things that have too clear of an identity, like a comb or something like that, because, or in one of my drawings, I put my glasses. The minute you see the glasses, it all changes. So where things look similar to, but they aren't like nature. But I think the nature of my drawing is that they're organic and that they propagate themselves.
This idea of memory, is the shadow the residue of the real?
You could say that. You could say that, because the residue, a perfect example is when a shadow of a railing falls on steps. So the railing is very normal now. When it goes down the steps, it actually kind of starts to distort everything. Throw the question at me again.
You were talking about memory, and the memory seems to be more on the shadow side than on your primitive side, the object side.
I would say the residue,
living thing.
You use the word residue, which I like. The drawing is the residue of the object over time, but the drawings actually create a residue. So there's literally a residue that's the imprint of my hand moving, drawing, because I'm tracing and I'm drawing. So there's a residue that is that film. That what I love about it is the computer can't do it. The computer can emulate it, but it can't give if I'm working more in one area, the residue is more. If I think philosophically about the residue, then I get more into the notion of, it's a Bachelard calls it a recollected memory. So he calls it daydream a recollected memory. And I like that, because when you recollect the memory, you embellish it with where you are at the moment. So, and that's the way my drawings are. You may see the bit of a model that looks like a truss, but then all of a sudden it melds into something else. So the residue for me is two things. One, the actual residue of the graphite, but also the residue of the dead or no longer existing object.
That residue, that smearing that you talk about, that happens from the artist's hand, that adds a certain tonality to your work. That's craftsmanship there. That's practiced, that tonality. Can you talk a little bit about that, and how then you bring out the whites, you bring out the lines on top of that?
Yeah, it's something, again, that happens just through the act of labor. Okay, so when I was learning to be an architect, of course, the goal was to keep the drawing clean. You worked on vellum. And then we had to work with ink on vellum. You had to scratch all this stuff. And then Mylar came along. Mylar was great for ink because you can erase it, but still it was not supposed to be smeary. I really like charcoal. I'm not really good at it. My wife's really good at it, but I like the softness, and I can teach students to use charcoal to actually make beautiful, sumptuous details, because it's such an amazing medium. But for me, when I use the graphite, I still have the point of the pencil, and I use lots of B leads, of course. So as I'm moving, it's moving along, and so it's naturally creating these areas. So almost anything I draw has enough of a patina on it that when I erase, the whites are really white. So I'm allowed to, I start off as an additive process while I'm putting it, and then it's subtractive. And then what I'll do is usually photograph it, put it into the computer with Photoshop, and maybe mess with it a little bit. I did more of that when I was printmaking. When I do my drawings, they are what they are. When I make my constructions, when I have to prepare them for the laser cutter and stuff, then I have to plan. But still, I plan for the pieces, not for the assembly. The assembly is my play part.
I could
You're-
jump in here
Oh,
question,
gentlemen,
Stacy?
for a second. We have about 5 minutes left, and we have a couple of questions from the audience.
Sure.
I'll give you a minute to finish your thought there, Tim, and then maybe we could jump into.
No, let's go on. I don't want to take up any more time.
Oh no, you were doing a great job. This has been a really wonderful conversation, and really fascinating to learn about your process, Tony, and inspiration. A question from Nick Nikolov is, he said, "Thank you, Tony. You have been an inspiration to me way before I joined you in stirring trouble at Lehigh. Your attentiveness to your creative process is profound. You have a process that you go through when naming your pieces, which is relevant given your conversation about narrative in your work."
Yeah, you know, Nick knows me, knows my work, he knows how I think. And I appreciate the compliment. I could reverse it, but you know, I have this discussion with Gordon Byrne all the time about words and images. And he's a man of words, I'm a man of images. I tend to feel like words usurp the image. So I'm very delicate about the words. So when I either will name it based on how it's perceived, like the airbrush I call levitation, because it just seemed like it was floating. Or if it becomes more narrative, like the bachelor's drawing, I'll call it a bachelor's. But I trouble over titles. I really go through a lot of things because I want the image to remain pliable and ambiguous, but also not completely, you know, there's something about the drawings that seems to hook a viewer, and they come into it, and it's not like looking at abstract paintings. They see some resemblance of something, but they don't know what it is. Is that good, Nick?
We had another question. So Krish and Tara Potash asked, can you describe?
I know him.
Yeah. Can you describe where your artistic attention has gone since your exhibit at the Allentown Art Museum? And then another comment is for Tim, any plans to get your criticism out into the public?
I want more of his stuff out there.
Fan mail from a flounder. If anyone remembers Rocky and Bullwinkle, know that one. Yeah, there are plans, but not to be discussed right now. It's all about Tony.
No, it's great. I want one. You write really well, and we need people like you out there. But anyway, back to
I appreciate it. Thank you.
No. What was the question again?
What are you doing now since?
Okay, what am I doing now? Well, you know, when I did that work, and Chris was great, he did a time exposure of the whole thing, which was great. I was just entering into the airbrush world. So for me, then I did a bunch of airbrushes since that time. And I've been working on more constructions, but I'm at the point now where I want to actually, and I'm being nudged from my wife to make some larger pieces out of Cortan steel and laser, you know, whatever, water jet and blah, blah, blah. So hopefully, you know, the problem with making something big is where do you put it? But I would like to spend this next, because I'm going to retire in a year. I want to spend this next year really exploring other materials. I want to work with Nick Nikolov on casting, because I think casting is something that is really would be appropriate for my work. And drawings. I'll do the drawings to the day I die, because they're really just meditative doodles. And whenever I'm feeling weird, I can just disappear into the drawing, which is pretty much fun for me.
Hey, I love the plexiglass work. That's just beautiful work. Any more of that coming?
Yeah, like I said, I had a traumatic experience because I finally sold one of them, and the stupid mailer mailed it UPS, and it came in pieces. So yeah,
I think Duchamp in there, don't you think?
Well, I know so I should have just brought it to the guy himself, because he was really rich and probably would have bought more. But anyway, I want to do more with plexiglass. I want to do more with glass. I wanted to get.
It's beautiful.
I talked to Corning Glass once. They said they're more involved with molding, and they said maybe call Pittsburgh Glass, because this rich guy that bought the piece was really entertaining the idea of maybe having me make a 5 foot by 5 foot by 5 foot fountain kind of thing out of glass and blah, blah, pay a fortune for. So I am investigating that. I love plexiglass. I love what it does. And I noticed the thicker the edge becomes, then it becomes a prism. So not only will it shoots these colors everywhere and flares of light, which are really great little surprises. But yeah, it's one of my favorite things, the plexiglass cube. So.
But they also seem like works I can inhabit. I could live in them.
Well, and I showed you that interior view.
Yeah.
My dream, if I had a ton of money, and I still may write grants for them, is I'd like to see this as a 10 foot by 10 foot by 10 foot cube, water running between the spaces, splashing on the pieces that stick out, because then it would create rainbows, and then the water would recycle in the bottom and go back. But you know, that's the architect in me. You know,
That's awesome.
it would be fun. Maybe one day when somebody's rich.
Yeah, well, I hope so.
Yeah.
Hopefully someone's listening, but can help you with that.
Okay. Anything else?
I want to give a few seconds or minutes for anyone in the audience who would like to unmute themselves if they didn't want to type their question in the group chat. If we have anyone who wants to ask a question to either of the presenters. We have a lot of great comments, both on Facebook and in the chat, just about the appreciation for seeing the evolution of your work, Tony, and just kind of from Callahan 321, the rich imagery for him and the depth and places to go within each place.
Yep, she's an old friend from Atlanta. Great. That's great.
Well, I think that we are at our time. This has been a wonderful presentation. So great to learn about your process, really inspirational. And I think we're all excited to see what you work on next. Thank you to all of the participants for joining us today, for Tim, for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
This is the last of our Art and Dialogue for this season. We are working on a whole slew of virtual programs, including Cocktails with a Curator. Mark Wanslitter, who is going to be teaching us how to make a martini while exploring Ellsworth Kelly's Green Triangle piece. And then on May 16th, we have another family workshop. But please stay tuned, check our website. We have a lot of great resources there. And thank you again for joining our conversation. And we look forward to seeing you all soon.
And I would like to thank Tim again, but also Stacy and William and everybody at LUAG. You guys have done a great job of following an amazing act by Ricardo. And these things, I didn't think they would be doable, but they've been so successful. I'm so glad you're doing them and reaching out to the community. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Okay.
Wow. Thank you, Tony, for your time, and Tim. Have a nice evening, everybody.
You too. Bye.